Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
To 1. The slip and fall that wasn't. Miss Jane Marple had always found American customs rather charming, though she would never have admitted as much to her grandniece Diana, who seemed convinced that everything beyond the borders of St. Mary Mead was infinitely superior to anything England had to offer. The truth was, as Miss Marple sipped her tea in Diana's cosy sitting room in Little Wickham, she found herself quite enchanted by this curious village that seemed to have sprung from the pages of an American magazine, complete with white picket fences and a main street that looked as though it had been designed specifically for a motion picture. "You simply must see sweet dreams, Aunt Jane," Diana had insisted that morning, her eyes bright with the enthusiasm of youth. "It's the most wonderful soda fountain, and everyone simply congregates there. Mrs. Whitfield has created something quite magical." Miss Marple had nodded politely, though privately she wondered what could be so magical about a place that served sweetened beverages and ice cream. Still, she had learned long ago that the social centres of any community, no matter how seemingly innocent, often provided the most illuminating glimpses into human nature. The soda fountain, when they arrived that Saturday afternoon, was indeed a marvel of modern American ingenuity. Chrome fixtures gleamed under bright lights, red leather stools lined a spotless marble counter, and a magnificent jukebox in the corner played melodies that seemed to transport the young patrons to some distant realm of happiness. The air was thick with the scent of vanilla and chocolate, punctuated by the sharp fizz of carbonated beverages and the cheerful chatter of teenagers who appeared to have adopted the establishment as their unofficial headquarters. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield presided over this domain with the stern authority of a headmistress. A woman of perhaps 45 years, she moved behind the counter with brisk efficiency, her greying hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to emphasise the sharp angles of her face. Miss Marple observed her with the quiet attention she reserved for particularly interesting specimens of humanity, noting how the woman's eyes missed nothing, how her voice carried just enough edge to keep even the most boisterous teenagers in line. "No feet on the stools, Tommy Fletcher," Mrs. Whitfield's voice cut through the afternoon chatter like a blade through butter. "And I'll thank you to keep your voice down when you're in my establishment." The young man in question, a lanky teenager with unruly brown hair, muttered something under his breath and slouched further into his seat. Miss Marple noticed the flash of resentment in his eyes, quickly masked but unmistakably present. It was the look she had seen countless times before, in countless young faces, the expression of someone who felt perpetually misunderstood and unfairly treated. "Mrs. Whitfield runs a tight ship," Diana murmured, steering Miss Marple toward a corner booth. "Some say she's too strict, but I rather admire her standards. These young people need guidance, don't you think?" Miss Marple made a non-committal sound, her attention caught by the other patrons scattered throughout the establishment. There was Mrs. Sarah Mills, a woman of middle years whose eyes followed Mrs. Whitfield's every movement with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. At the far end of the counter sat a nervous-looking gentleman whom Diana identified as Mr. Pemberton, the pharmacist from the shop next door. His fingers drummed an anxious rhythm on the marble surface as he nursed what appeared to be a cup of coffee grown cold. "And that's Janet Whitfield," Diana continued, nodding toward a young woman who emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of Sunday glasses. "Mrs. Whitfield's daughter. There's been some tension there lately, I'm told. Janet has rather modern ideas about how the business should be run." Miss Marple studied the younger woman with interest. Janet possessed her mother's sharp features but softened by youth and what appeared to be a more generous temperament. Still, there was something in the set of her shoulders, in the way she avoided her mother's gaze, that suggested the tension Diana had mentioned was rather more serious than a simple disagreement about business practices. The afternoon wore on pleasantly enough, with Miss Marple content to observe the small dramas that played out before her. She watched Tommy Fletcher's increasingly sullen responses to Mrs. Whitfield's corrections, noted the way Mr. Pemberton's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his cup, observed how Mrs. Mills seemed to catalogue every detail of the soda fountain's operation with the intensity of a military strategist. It was precisely 3:30 when Mrs. Whitfield stepped out from behind the counter, a small glass of cherry cola in her hand. This, Miss Marple had learned, was the woman's daily ritual, a brief respite from her duties when she would review the day's receipts while enjoying her favourite beverage. "Same time every day," Diana had whispered earlier. "You could set your watch by it." Mrs. Whitfield had taken perhaps 3 sips of her cola when the convulsions began. At first, Miss Marple thought the woman was choking, but there was something wrong about the movements, something that spoke of a deeper disturbance than a simple obstruction. Mrs. Whitfield's back arched violently, her arms flailing with uncontrolled spasms, and when she fell, it was not the stumbling descent of someone who had lost their footing on a slippery surface. The sound of her head striking the marble counter was sickeningly final. In the chaos that followed, as people rushed to help and voices rose in alarm, Miss Marple remained seated, her sharp eyes taking in details that others, in their panic, might miss. The small puddle of spilled ice cream near where Mrs. Whitfield had fallen, positioned with suspicious precision. The fact that the woman's pupils, in those brief moments before help arrived, were dilated far beyond what one would expect from a simple fall. Most telling of all was the expression on Mrs. Whitfield's face in those final moments before consciousness left her. It was not the confused surprise of someone who had slipped, but the dawning horror of someone who realised too late that they had been betrayed. By the time Dr. Haydock arrived, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield was beyond earthly help, but Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her corner booth while others wept and speculated about the tragic accident, was already certain that what they had witnessed was no accident at all. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 2? Chapter 2. Secrets. In the wet floor. Warning. The morning after Mrs. Whitfield's death brought with it the peculiar hush that settles over a community when tragedy strikes close to home. Miss Marple, never one to let grass grow under her feet when faced with a puzzle that demanded solving, had risen early and taken what Diana assumed was a leisurely constitutional through the village. In truth, Miss Marple's morning walk was anything but leisurely, being rather more in the nature of a reconnaissance mission. She had paused outside Sweet Dreams, noting how different the establishment looked in the grey light of dawn. The cheerful chrome fixtures seemed tarnished, the red leather stools forlorn and empty. A handwritten sign in the window proclaimed the soda fountain closed until further notice. But Miss Marple's interest lay not in the sign itself, but in the small detail that others had overlooked. Inspector Slack arrived at Diana's cottage shortly after breakfast, his manner suggesting a man who considered himself quite capable of handling what he obviously viewed as a straightforward case of accidental death. "Terrible business," he announced, settling his considerable bulk into Diana's best armchair, with the air of one conferring a favour. But clear enough, I'm afraid. Poor woman slipped on some spilled ice cream, hit her head on that marble counter. Dr. Haydock confirmed she died from the head injury. Miss Marple, who had been quietly knitting in the corner, looked up with the mild expression that those who knew her had learned to regard with considerable wariness. "How very unfortunate," she murmured. "And the wet floor sign, Inspector?" I noticed it had been placed quite prominently near where the accident occurred. Inspector Slack's chest puffed with importance. "Exactly so. Shows the woman was trying to be careful, marking the hazard. Makes it all the more tragic, really. Despite her precautions, she still managed to slip." "Indeed." Miss Marple's needles clicked gently, though I confess I found it rather curious that the floor beneath the sign appeared to be quite dry, save for a small puddle of what looked to be cherry syrup, rather precisely placed, one might say. The inspector's expression grew less certain. Cherry syrup? From the soda fountain, I would imagine, though I do wonder how it came to be spilled in just that spot, and why Mrs. Whitfield, who by all accounts was most particular about cleanliness, hadn't noticed it during her afternoon routine. Diana, sensing undercurrents she didn't quite understand, offered tea, which was gratefully accepted by the inspector and politely declined by Miss Marple, who seemed disinclined to interrupt her train of thought. "You see," Miss Marple continued, her voice taking on the conversational tone that often preceded her most devastating observations, "I couldn't help but notice that poor Mrs. Whitfield's fall didn't quite match what one might expect from someone who had simply lost their footing. The convulsions came first, didn't they? Rather violent ones, and her pupils were most remarkably dilated. It reminded me rather forcibly of poor Mrs. Bantry's prize roses when they were accidentally treated with the wrong sort of fertilizer. The same sort of muscular spasms, you understand." Inspector Slack shifted uncomfortably. "Are you suggesting something other than an accident, Miss Marple?" "Oh, I wouldn't presume to suggest anything to such an experienced officer as yourself," Miss Marple replied with perfect sincerity. "Though I did think you might find it interesting that I happened to encounter Dr. Haydock this morning during my walk, and he mentioned that the preliminary examination had revealed traces of strychnine in poor Mrs. Whitfield's system, administered, he believes, through her afternoon cherry cola." The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the gentle clicking of Miss Marple's knitting needles and Inspector Slack's sharp intake of breath. "Strychnine?" Diana gasped. "But that means—" "Murder," Inspector Slack finished grimly, his entire demeanour transforming as the implication sank in. "The fall wasn't the cause of death at all. It was a seizure brought on by the poison." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Dr. Haydock was quite certain. The head injury was severe, to be sure, but Mrs. Whitfield would have died from the strychnine regardless. The fall and the carefully placed wet floor sign were merely meant to provide a plausible explanation for her death. "But who would want to kill Eleanor Whitfield?" Diana asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Inspector Slack had recovered his professional composure and was already making notes. "That's what we need to find out. Miss Marple, I don't suppose you noticed anything else during your observations yesterday?" Miss Marple set down her knitting and folded her hands in her lap. "Well, there were rather a lot of people in the soda fountain yesterday afternoon. Young Tommy Fletcher, for instance, who seemed to bear some resentment toward Mrs. Whitfield's strict management style. Mrs. Sarah Mills, who appeared to be studying the establishment with unusual intensity. Mr. Pemberton from the pharmacy next door, who seemed rather nervous about something. And of course, Janet Whitfield herself, who clearly had some sort of ongoing disagreement with her mother. Any one of them could have had access to the cherry cola, Inspector Slack mused. The question is motive. "Oh, I think you'll find that motive is rarely in short supply when it comes to murder," Miss Marple observed. "People do tend to accumulate grievances over the years, don't they? Like dust in corners that haven't been properly swept." Inspector Slack stood, his notebook clutched firmly in his hand. "I'll need to question everyone who was in the soda fountain yesterday, and I'll want to examine the premises more thoroughly." After he had gone, Diana turned to her great-aunt with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Aunt Jane, how on earth did you know to look for signs of poisoning? Most people would have accepted the accident explanation." Miss Marple smiled gently as she resumed her knitting. "Experience, my dear. You see, I've noticed that when people are genuinely surprised by a fall, They tend to reach out instinctively to break it. Mrs. Whitfield's arms were rigid, her back arched. It was the posture of someone in the grip of convulsions, not someone trying to prevent a tumble. And the wet floor sign. Rather too convenient, wouldn't you say? If someone had genuinely spilled ice cream, they would have cleaned it up immediately, not simply placed a warning sign and left the mess. But if someone wanted to create the appearance of an accident after the fact, well, a strategically placed sign and a small puddle of syrup would serve admirably. Diana shuddered. It's horrible to think that someone planned it all so carefully. Murder usually is planned carefully, dear. At least successful murder is. The question now is whether our killer was quite as clever as they believed themselves to be. Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle rhythm, but her mind was far from the peaceful domestic scene. She was thinking about wet floor signs and cherry syrup, about dilated pupils and muscular spasms, and most particularly about the look of dawning horror she had seen in Eleanor Whitfield's eyes in those final moments. Someone in that cheerful soda fountain had decided that Mrs. Whitfield needed to die, and they had been prepared to go to considerable lengths to make it appear accidental. But they had reckoned without Miss Jane Marple's sharp eyes and long experience with the darker aspects of human nature. The game, as they say, was afoot. Chapter 3. The Pharmacist's Slippery Alibi. The village of Little Wickham had never seen such excitement, though it was the sort of excitement that decent people whispered about behind closed doors rather than discussed openly at the post office. Murder, Miss Marple reflected as she made her way down the main street, had a way of bringing out both the best and worst in human nature, often simultaneously. She had persuaded Diana to accompany her on what she termed a little shopping expedition, though her true purpose was to observe the reactions of the various suspects. Now that Inspector Slack had begun his inquiries, the inspector himself had proven surprisingly receptive to her suggestions, perhaps because he had encountered Miss Marple's particular talents during a previous case and had learned to respect her insights, however unconventional they might appear. Pemberton's pharmacy occupied a narrow building wedged between Sweet Dreams and the local haberdashery, its dusty windows displaying an assortment of patent medicines and toiletries that suggested a proprietor more concerned with utility than aesthetics. The bell above the door gave a tired chime as they entered, and Miss Marple noted immediately that the shop possessed the peculiar atmosphere of a place where secrets were kept as carefully as prescriptions. Mr. Pemberton emerged from behind the counter with the nervous energy of a rabbit sensing a fox in the vicinity. He was a thin man of perhaps 50 years, with prematurely grey hair and the sort of pale complexion that suggested too many hours spent indoors. His hands, Miss Marple observed, showed the telltale tremor she had noticed the previous day, though it seemed more pronounced now. "Miss Marple, Miss Sterling," he said, his voice pitched slightly higher than normal. "How may I help you? Though I must say it's been a terrible shock about poor Mrs. Whitfield. Terrible shock indeed." "Indeed it has," Miss Marple agreed, her tone gently sympathetic. "Such a tragedy. Though I understand from Inspector Slack that it wasn't quite the accident we all assumed." Mr. Pemberton's hand stilled for a moment. Then resumed their trembling with renewed vigour. Not an accident. But surely the wet floor, the fall. "Poison, I'm afraid," Diana supplied, her voice hushed with the gravity of the revelation. "Strychnine, Dr. Haydock believes." The effect of this announcement was immediate and dramatic. Mr. Pemberton's face went from pale to ashen, and he gripped the edge of the counter so tightly that his knuckles went white. "Strychnine," he whispered. "But that's That's a controlled substance, very dangerous, very restricted. Miss Marple tilted her head with the inquiring expression of a bird considering a particularly interesting worm. I imagine you would know about such things, being a pharmacist. Quite a responsibility, having access to such dangerous substances. Oh yes, very much so, Mr. Pemberton said, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to explain. Everything is carefully controlled, you understand. Locked away, accounted for. Inspector Slack has already been here this morning, checking our records. Everything is in perfect order. How reassuring, Miss Marple murmured. And I'm sure you were able to provide him with a clear account of your whereabouts yesterday afternoon. Certainly. I was here in the shop, naturally, working on prescriptions, serving customers. Mrs. Henderson came in for her arthritis medication, and young Billy Watson needed ointment for his mother's burns. All perfectly normal. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. How fortunate that you have such a clear recollection, though I suppose it must be rather difficult, being so close to the scene of the tragedy. The walls between these old buildings can be quite thin, can't they? Mr. Pemberton's eyes darted nervously toward the back of the shop. Well, yes, I suppose. That is, one does occasionally hear, but surely you're not suggesting— Oh, I'm not suggesting anything, Miss Marple assured him with a smile that was both innocent and somehow unsettling. I was merely thinking how convenient it must be for you, having your business so close to Mrs. Whitfield's. Easy to pop back and forth, I should imagine. Pop back and forth? Mr. Pemberton's voice cracked slightly. I'm afraid I don't understand. Diana, who had been examining a display of hair tonics with elaborate casualness, looked up with interest. Aunt Jane means the connection between the buildings, don't you? The old basement passage that runs under both shops. It's quite common in these old buildings, I'm told. The silence that followed this observation was broken only by the ticking of the large clock on the wall and the distant sound of traffic from the main street. Mr. Pemberton's face had gone from ashen to a peculiar shade of green. That is, the basement is mostly used for storage, he stammered. Hardly ever go down there myself. Too damp, you understand. Bad for the medications. Miss Marple's eyes had taken on the sharp quality that those who knew her well had learned to recognise as distinctly dangerous. Of course, though I imagine Inspector Slack will want to examine it thoroughly. Such a thorough man, the inspector. He mentioned to me that he's particularly interested in the precise timing of yesterday's events. Timing? Mr. Pemberton's voice was now barely above a whisper. Well, yes. You see, Mrs. Whitfield was murdered at precisely 3:30, according to Dr. Haydock's calculations. The inspector is naturally anxious to establish exactly where everyone was at that crucial moment. Mr. Pemberton's hands were now shaking so violently that he had to clasp them together to maintain any semblance of composure. I was here, as I said, working on prescriptions. With your assistant, I presume? Miss Marple's tone remained conversational, but there was steel beneath the velvet. My assistant? Well, actually, Miss Hartwell was— She had gone to lunch. Early lunch, you understand. She often does on Saturdays. How inconvenient for your alibi, Diana observed with the sort of tactless directness that often proves surprisingly effective. Mr. Pemberton's composure cracked entirely. It's not what you think. Yes, I knew Eleanor, Mrs. Whitfield, but not in the way you're implying. It was business, strictly business. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression encouraging. What sort of business, Mr. Pemberton? The pharmacist looked around desperately as if hoping for rescue from some unexpected quarter. When none appeared, he seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon. She had been helping me with certain customers, he said finally, people who couldn't afford proper medical care. I would provide medications at cost and she would help distribute them. Discreetly. Through the soda fountain? Miss Marple asked. Sometimes. A bottle of cough syrup with a milkshake. Pain medication with an ice cream sundae. It seemed harmless enough. Charitable, even. But illegal, Diana pointed out. Technically, yes. But we were helping people who couldn't afford to see a doctor. Mrs. Whitfield understood the need for discretion. Miss Marple's needles had appeared in her hands as if by magic, and she was knitting with a mechanical precision that indicated deep thought. And this arrangement was profitable for both of you. Mr. Pemberton's face flushed. Mrs. Whitfield, she began to demand a larger share of the proceeds, said she was taking all the risk, having the medications on her premises. She threatened to expose the whole operation unless I agreed to her terms. Blackmail, Miss Marple said gently. She called it a business renegotiation. But yes, I suppose, if you put it that way. And you had access to strychnine through your pharmacy supplies. I had access to many things, but I didn't. I would never. Mrs. Whitfield was difficult, but I'm not a murderer. Miss Marple studied him with the sort of penetrating gaze that seemed to see through all pretense to the truth beneath. No, she said finally. I don't believe you are. But you're not telling us everything, are you, Mr. Pemberton? The pharmacist's shoulders sagged. There's nothing more to tell. I was here alone when it happened. I can't prove it, but it's the truth. As they left the pharmacy, Diana turned to her great-aunt with obvious curiosity. Do you believe him? Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her mind clearly working through the implications of what they had learned. I believe he's telling the truth about the illegal prescription business and about Mrs. Whitfield's blackmail, but there's something else, something he's not telling us. What sort of something? I'm not entirely certain yet, but did you notice how he reacted when we mentioned the basement connection, and his insistence that he never goes down there? I think, my dear Diana, that we need to have a word with Inspector Slack about examining that basement rather more thoroughly than he might otherwise have planned. You think Mr. Pemberton used the basement to reach the soda fountain? I think, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, that there are more secrets in this village than we've yet uncovered, and until we know what they are, we can't be certain who among our suspects is the murderer. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the main street as they walked back toward Diana's cottage, but Miss Marple's mind was still occupied with trembling hands, illegal prescriptions, and the question of what exactly Mr. Pemberton was so desperate to hide. Chapter 4, Love Letters Behind the Counter. Inspector Slack had proven himself a man of unexpected thoroughness when properly motivated, and the discovery of murder had certainly provided the necessary motivation. By Tuesday morning, he had assembled what he considered a comprehensive picture of the victim's final day, though Miss Marple suspected there were still pieces missing from the puzzle. The basement connection checks out, he reported to Miss Marple and Diana over tea in the cottage garden. Pemberton could have accessed the soda fountain without being seen, though he maintains he was in his shop the entire afternoon. His assistant confirms she was at lunch from 3:15 to 4 o'clock, so his alibi for the crucial time is worthless. Miss Marple poured tea with the deliberate care she reserved for moments when her mind was working at its sharpest. And the strychnine. Pemberton's records show no discrepancies, but strychnine's used in rat poison, as well as medical applications. A determined person could obtain it from several sources. Inspector Slack paused to add sugar to his tea. What's more interesting is what we found when we searched the soda fountain more thoroughly. Oh? Miss Marple's tone was politely inquiring, but Diana had learned to recognise the alert stillness that indicated her great-aunt's intense interest. Hidden compartment behind the cash register, quite cleverly concealed actually. Took us the better part of yesterday to find it. Inspector Slack's satisfaction was evident. Filled with letters dating back to 1952, Love letters, from the look of them. Diana nearly dropped her teacup. Love letters? But Mrs. Whitfield was a widow, wasn't she? Widow, yes, but these letters predate her marriage. Addressed to Eleanor Mason, which was her maiden name. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. Passionate stuff, though the writer was careful never to sign his full name, just used the initial R. Miss Marple set down her cup with particular precision. How very interesting, and the content of these letters. Promises to leave his wife, declarations of eternal love, that sort of thing. But here's the curious part. The letters stop abruptly in late 1952, and there's a final note that's quite different in tone. Apologetic, saying he can't continue the relationship, that his family obligations must come first. A married man, Diana murmured. Oh, how scandalous. More scandalous than you might think, Inspector Slack continued. We've pieced together from other sources that Eleanor Mason left Little Wickham rather suddenly in late 1952, pregnant and unmarried. She returned 6 months later as Mrs. Whitfield, married to a man who died in a farming accident just 2 years after the wedding. Miss Marple's knitting needles had appeared, as they often did when she needed to think. So Janet Whitfield's father may not have been the man she believed him to be? Exactly. And if Eleanor kept those letters all these years, hidden but accessible, it suggests she wasn't ready to let the past rest. Blackmail again, Diana said. She was using the letters to control this mysterious R. Inspector Slack nodded grimly. That's our theory. The question is, who is R? Someone still living in the village, someone with enough to lose that he'd pay to keep the secret buried. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. Have you spoken to Janet about this discovery? Yesterday evening. Poor girl was devastated. Claims she had no idea about the letters or about her true parentage. Says her mother told her that her father died when she was very young, and she never questioned it. But she did know something was troubling her mother recently. Oh yes. Said there'd been tension for months, arguments about money and the future of the business. Janet wanted to modernise, bring in younger customers, but Mrs. Whitfield was adamant about maintaining her standards. More than that, though, Janet said her mother had been acting strangely, making cryptic comments about people getting what they deserve and secrets that can't stay buried forever. Miss Marple paused in her knitting. Did Janet ever see any of these mysterious visitors who might have been paying for her mother's silence? She mentioned that her mother often had private meetings in the soda fountain after hours, said she assumed they were business discussions, but now she's not so certain. And the identity of R? Have you any theories? Inspector Slack's expression grew frustrated. Several men in the village whose names begin with R, but most of them would have been too young in 1952, or weren't living here then. We're working through the possibilities. Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting and gazed thoughtfully across the garden. Inspector, when you examined these letters, did you notice anything particular about the handwriting, the paper, the way they were folded? Standard writing paper of the period, blue ink, educated hand. The letters were carefully preserved, kept in chronological order. Why do you ask? Oh, just a thought. You see, in my experience, people who keep love letters usually do so for one of two reasons. Either they're treasured mementos of a lost love, or they're insurance policies for the future. Diana leaned forward with interest. You think Mrs. Whitfield always intended to use them for blackmail? I think Mrs. Whitfield was a woman who understood the value of information. The question is whether she was content to collect her blackmail quietly, or whether recent events had prompted her to become more aggressive in her demands. Inspector Slack consulted his notes again. Janet mentioned that her mother had been talking about writing her memoirs, something about telling the real story of Little Wickham's golden years. Could be relevant. Memoirs? Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. How very ambitious of her, and potentially quite dangerous for certain members of the community. You think the threat of public exposure might have driven someone to murder? I think, Inspector, that people will go to extraordinary lengths to protect their reputations, particularly people who have built their current lives on the foundation of carefully buried secrets. Inspector Slack drained his teacup and stood, I'd better get back to identifying this R. If Mrs. Whitfield was threatening to expose him publicly, he certainly had motive for murder. After he had gone, Diana turned to her great-aunt with obvious curiosity. "You have an idea about who R might be, don't you?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle rhythm. "I have several ideas, dear, but ideas are not the same as proof, and in a murder case, proof is essential." "But surely the letters provide a clear motive. If this man has been paying blackmail for years, and Mrs. Whitfield was threatening to expose him publicly." "Oh, I quite agree that the letters provide motive, but there's something that troubles me about the whole situation." "What sort of something?" Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her mind clearly working through the implications of what they had learned. "Well, dear, if Mrs. Whitfield had been successfully blackmailing this man for years, why would she suddenly decide to write memoirs that would expose him? Successful blackmail depends on keeping the secret, not revealing it. Unless she was planning to retire and wanted one final large payment. Perhaps, or unless something had changed in her relationship with her victim. Something that made her angry enough to abandon the profitable arrangement in favour of revenge." Diana shuddered slightly. "It's rather horrible, isn't it? All these secrets and lies festering away beneath the surface of a seemingly pleasant village." Miss Marple smiled sadly. "I'm afraid that's often the way of things, my dear. People are remarkably good at maintaining facades, even when their private lives are quite different from what they appear to be. The trick in a case like this is determining which facade is hiding a murderer." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the garden, Miss Marple continued her knitting, but her mind was occupied with love letters and hidden compartments, with promises broken and secrets kept, and with the question of what could drive someone to abandon years of profitable blackmail in favour of deadly revenge. Chapter 5. The High School Reunion Revenge. Wednesday morning brought with it the sort of crisp autumn weather that made even the most sedentary individuals consider taking brisk walks, and Miss Marple was certainly not one to ignore such an invitation from nature. She had persuaded Diana to accompany her to the village library, ostensibly to research the local history, but actually to pursue a line of inquiry that had occurred to her during the previous evening's reflections. The Little Wickham Public Library occupied a charming brick building that had once served as the village school, and its librarian, Miss Dorothy Finch, possessed the sort of encyclopedic knowledge of local affairs that made her invaluable to anyone seeking information about the community's past. "Miss Marple, Miss Sterling, how lovely to see you," Miss Finch chirped, emerging from behind a stack of returned books with the eager expression of someone who rarely received visitors with interesting questions. "I do hope you're finding our little village educational." "Indeed we are," Miss Marple replied with perfect sincerity. "In fact, I was hoping you might be able to help us with a small historical inquiry. We're particularly interested in the high school class of 1952. Miss Finch's eyes lit up with professional enthusiasm. "Oh, the class of 52! What a remarkable group they were! I was just a year behind them myself, so I remember them quite well. Is there something specific you'd like to know?" "We understand there's to be a reunion soon," Diana said, following her great-aunt's lead with admirable smoothness. "Well, there was supposed to be," Miss Finch said, her expression growing somewhat troubled. "Mrs. Whitfield had been organising it for months. A 25-year reunion, it would have been. But I'm afraid the response was rather disappointing." Miss Marple settled into one of the comfortable reading chairs with the air of someone prepared to listen to a long and detailed account. "Disappointing in what way?" "Oh, Several of the local graduates declined to attend, despite still living right here in the village. Most peculiar, really, since they'd all been such close friends in school. Robert Hartwell begged off, claiming mayoral duties, and James Morrison from the bank said he was too busy with year-end accounts. Sarah Mills simply said she wasn't interested in reliving the past. "How very strange," Miss Marple murmured. "One would think that people would be eager to reconnect with old classmates." Miss Finch leaned forward conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I think Mrs. Whitfield was rather hurt by the lack of enthusiasm. She'd been so excited about the project, talking about how it would be wonderful to share memories of their golden years together." "Golden years," Diana repeated thoughtfully. "That's rather an interesting phrase." Mrs. Whitfield used it frequently when discussing the reunion. She had such grand plans, you know. A formal dinner, speeches about their accomplishments, even a special presentation about the class's contributions to the community. Miss Marple's needles had appeared, as they inevitably did when her mind was working through a particularly complex problem. And the cost of attending this reunion? Miss Finch's expression grew somewhat uncomfortable. Well, that was another source of concern, actually. Mrs. Whitfield had set the reunion fee quite high. $50 per person, which seemed excessive for a simple dinner and dance. $50? Diana's eyebrows rose. That does seem rather steep. Most people thought so. When I mentioned it to Mayor Hartwell, he nearly choked on his coffee, said it was highway robbery for a high school reunion. Miss Marple's knitting paused momentarily. "You spoke to the mayor about the reunion?" "Oh, yes, several times. Mrs. Whitfield had asked him to give the keynote speech about the class's achievements. He seemed quite reluctant, kept making excuses about his busy schedule. And the others who declined, did they give specific reasons?" Miss Finch glanced around the empty library, then lowered her voice. "Well, I probably shouldn't repeat gossip, but James Morrison told his secretary that he wouldn't pay Eleanor Whitfield's extortion fees just to listen to her speeches. Rather harsh language, I thought." "Extortion fees," Miss Marple repeated softly. "How very illuminating. I'm sure he didn't mean anything by it. People do tend to exaggerate when they're annoyed about money. Indeed they do. Tell me, Miss Finch, do you recall anything particularly significant about the class of 1952? Any notable events or scandals from their senior year?" The librarian's cheeks flushed slightly. "Well, there was some talk about inappropriate behaviour at the spring dance. But you know how rumours spread in a small town. Nothing was ever proven." "What sort of inappropriate behaviour?" "Oh, the usual teenage foolishness. Drinking, couples disappearing together, that sort of thing. There was one incident that caused quite a stir, though. Someone drove their car into Miller's Pond after the dance, but they claimed it was an accident. Poor visibility, slippery roads." Miss Marple's hand stilled completely. "An accident involving a car?" "Yes, though there were whispers that the driver had been drinking. Nothing official, you understand. The sheriff at the time was quite lenient with the young people, especially if their families were prominent in the community." "And do you recall who was involved in this accident?" Miss Finch hesitated, clearly torn between her natural discretion and her obvious desire to be helpful. "I probably shouldn't say, but it's been so many years, and everyone involved is respectable now. It was Robert Hartwell's car, though he claimed someone else had been driving it that night." "How very convenient for young Mr. Hartwell." "Oh, I'm sure it was perfectly innocent. Boys will be boys, as they say, and no one was seriously hurt." Diana leaned forward with interest. Was anyone else in the car? There were rumours about a girl, but she was never identified publicly. The whole thing was hushed up quite quickly. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her expression had taken on the focused intensity that Diana had learned to recognise as significant. "And Mrs. Whitfield? Was she involved in any of these teenage adventures?" Eleanor Mason was always rather observant. She had a way of being present when interesting things happened, if you understand my meaning. Some people found it quite annoying. "The sort of person who might remember details that others preferred to forget." "Exactly, though I'm sure she meant no harm by it." As they left the library, Diana waited until they were well out of earshot before expressing her thoughts. It sounds like Mrs. Whitfield was using the reunion as another form of blackmail, doesn't it? High fees to force people to pay for her silence. Miss Marple nodded grimly. I'm afraid that's exactly what it sounds like. The reunion was to be her grand finale, so to speak, a final collection from all her victims before she revealed their secrets in her memoirs. But that doesn't make sense. Why collect money and then expose them anyway? Perhaps she had decided that money was no longer sufficient compensation for whatever grievances she harboured. Or perhaps she realised that her victims were growing desperate enough to take drastic action. Diana shuddered. You mean she knew someone might try to kill her? I think Mrs. Whitfield understood that she had pushed her luck as far as it would go. The question is whether she realised quite how far someone was prepared to go to stop her. They walked in thoughtful silence for several minutes before Miss Marple spoke again. I think, my dear, that we need to have a conversation with Mayor Hartwell. A man in his position would have a great deal to lose if old scandals were made public. Do you think he's our mysterious R? Robert Hartwell would certainly fit the initial, and if he was involved in covering up a serious accident in 1952, and if Mrs. Whitfield witnessed something that could destroy his political career, it would give him a powerful motive for murder. Miss Marple's needles clicked with determined rhythm as they made their way through the village streets. Indeed it would. The question now is whether we can prove it before he realises how much we've discovered. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the main street, and Miss Marple couldn't help but notice how the cheerful facades of the shops and houses seemed to conceal an almost sinister undercurrent of long-buried secrets and carefully maintained lies. It was, she reflected, rather like the village itself, pleasant on the surface but harbouring dark truths that someone had been willing to kill to protect. Chapter 6. Sabotage in the ice cream freezer. Thursday morning found Inspector Slack in a state of considerable agitation, pacing the length of Diana's sitting room with the restless energy of a man who had discovered that his investigation was far more complex than he had initially anticipated. Miss Marple observed his perturbation with the calm attention she might have devoted to studying a particularly interesting specimen of butterfly. The ice cream freezer, he announced without preamble, has been tampered with. Deliberately sabotaged, in fact. Diana nearly dropped her teacup. Sabotaged? But why on earth would anyone want to damage an ice cream freezer? Because, Inspector Slack said grimly, it wasn't being used solely for ice cream. We found a false bottom, cleverly concealed, containing enough prescription medications to stock a small pharmacy. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm. How very ingenious! And these medications were part of Mr. Pemberton's illegal operation. Precisely. But here's the curious thing. The sabotage occurred after Mrs. Whitfield's death. Someone broke into the soda fountain during the night and attempted to destroy the evidence. Which suggests, Miss Marple observed thoughtfully, that our murderer was either unaware of the hiding place initially, or was prevented from dealing with it at the time of the murder. Inspector Slack nodded emphatically. Exactly what I thought. The killer didn't have time to clean up all the loose ends on Saturday afternoon. Diana leaned forward with interest. But surely breaking in after the murder would be terribly risky. The building must have been watched. Not as closely as it should have been, apparently. The break-in was discovered yesterday morning when we returned for a more thorough search. Whoever did it was careful, but not careful enough. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her expression had taken on the particular intensity that indicated her mind was working through the implications of this new development. Tell me, Inspector, What exactly was the nature of this sabotage? Chemical damage to the cooling system, designed to destroy anything stored inside. But the perpetrator was interrupted, possibly by a passing constable on his rounds. The job was only half finished. And the medications that survived? Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. Quite a collection. Pain relievers, antibiotics, even some controlled substances that would require careful prescriptions, all stored in waterproof containers, labelled with initials rather than full names. Initials, Miss Marple murmured. How very organised. Almost like a filing system. That's what we thought. Mrs. Whitfield was running quite a sophisticated operation. But here's what's really interesting. Some of the medications were being distributed through the soda fountain's regular menu items. Diana's eyes widened. You mean customers were receiving drugs with their ice cream sundaes? In a manner of speaking, we found evidence of a coding system. Certain combinations of flavours and toppings indicated specific medications. A customer would order a chocolate sundae with extra cherries, for instance, and receive their prescription hidden in the whipped cream. Miss Marple set down her knitting entirely. How very clever! And I suppose young Tommy Fletcher was instrumental in this distribution system. He's admitted as much. Claims he thought he was helping people who couldn't afford proper medical care. Says Mrs. Whitfield convinced him it was a charitable endeavour. But profitable charity, no doubt. Very profitable. We estimate the operation was generating several $100s per month in additional income for Mrs. Whitfield. Miss Marple stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the peaceful village street with an expression that suggested she was seeing far more than the pleasant domestic scene before her. Inspector, have you considered that this illegal operation might provide an additional motive for murder? How do you mean? Well, if Mrs. Whitfield was planning to expose her blackmail victims through her memoirs, she might also have been planning to end the prescription operation. Perhaps she had decided that the risks were becoming too great. Inspector Slack's eyes sharpened, and someone who depended on that operation might have killed her to prevent its closure. Or someone who feared exposure through the operation's records. After all, the customer's initials were carefully documented. If Mrs. Whitfield had been keeping detailed records, she could have exposed not only her blackmail victims, but also everyone who had participated in the illegal prescription scheme. Diana had been following this exchange with growing alarm, but that would implicate dozens of people in the village. Anyone who couldn't afford proper medical care and had been buying medications through the soda fountain. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her expression grave. I'm afraid that's exactly the problem, my dear. Mrs. Whitfield had accumulated an enormous amount of potentially damaging information about a great many people. Inspector Slack resumed his pacing, which brings us back to the question of who had both the opportunity and the desperation necessary to commit murder. And the knowledge to sabotage the freezer afterward, Miss Marple added. That suggests someone with technical expertise, or at least someone familiar with the refrigeration systems. We're checking into that, but it's proving more complicated than expected. Half the village seems to have had some connection to either the blackmail operation or the prescription scheme. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, but her hands moved with the automatic precision of someone whose mind was elsewhere. Inspector, when you questioned Tommy Fletcher about his role in the operation, did he mention anything about Mrs. Whitfield's future plans? He said she'd been talking about cleaning house recently, making changes to the business model. Cleaning house, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, a rather ominous phrase under the circumstances. Tommy thought she meant modernising the soda fountain, bringing in new equipment and updating the menu, but given what we now know, she might have been planning to eliminate both the blackmail and the prescription operations. A fresh start, so to speak. Diana shook her head in bewilderment. But why would she give up such profitable enterprises? Miss Marple's needles clicked with particular emphasis. Perhaps because she had realised that her victims were becoming desperate enough to take drastic action. Or perhaps because she had decided that public exposure through her memoirs would be more satisfying than continued secrecy. Revenge rather than profit, Inspector Slack mused. Exactly. A woman who felt that she had been wronged decades ago might eventually decide that financial compensation was insufficient. She might want public vindication instead. Inspector Slack made several notes before looking up again. There's one more thing. We found evidence that Mrs. Whitfield had been planning to meet someone privately on the day she died, an appointment notation in her personal calendar marked simply with the letter R and the time 3:30. Miss Marple's hands stilled completely. 3:30, the exact time of her death. It appears that Mrs. Whitfield arranged to meet her killer. Whether she suspected his intentions or not, we may never know. "Oh, I think she suspected," Miss Marple said quietly. "The question is whether she thought she could control the situation, or whether she had decided that the risk was worth taking." Diana shuddered. To think that she deliberately arranged a meeting with someone she knew might be dangerous. Mrs. Whitfield was a woman who had spent decades manipulating others through their secrets. She may have believed that her knowledge gave her power over anyone who threatened her. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Well, power or no power, someone managed to poison her, and I intend to find out who. As the inspector took his leave, Miss Marple remained seated by the window, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The revelation of the sabotaged freezer had added another layer of complexity to an already intricate case, but it had also provided a crucial insight into the killer's state of mind. Someone had been desperate enough to risk everything by returning to the scene of the crime, and that desperation suggested a person who had far more to lose than simple exposure for blackmail or illegal prescriptions. It suggested someone whose entire life would be destroyed if Mrs. Whitfield's secrets were revealed. Chapter 7, The Teenage Diary Discovery. Friday afternoon brought with it the sort of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into one's very bones, and Miss Marple found herself grateful for the warmth of Diana's sitting room as Inspector Slack arrived with news that promised to shed considerable light on the increasingly complex web of secrets surrounding Mrs. Whitfield's murder. "We found her diary," he announced without preamble, settling into his customary chair with the satisfied air of a man who had made a significant breakthrough. Hidden in the basement of the soda fountain, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked behind a loose brick in the foundation wall. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with the sharp attention that those who knew her had learned to recognise as distinctly dangerous. A diary from the time of the murder. Better than that, a diary from 1952 kept during her final year of high school. It contains the complete story of her relationship with our mysterious R, and his identity is no longer mysterious at all. Diana leaned forward eagerly. "Who is it?" "Robert Hartwell, the current mayor of Little Wickham." Inspector Slack's voice carried the grim satisfaction of a man who had finally assembled the crucial pieces of a complex puzzle. The diary details their entire affair, from the first innocent encounters through the pregnancy, and his eventual abandonment of her. Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythm. How very illuminating. And I presume the diary also contains other information that Mrs. Whitfield found useful over the years. Indeed it does. Eleanor Mason was remarkably observant for a teenager, and remarkably thorough in recording what she observed. The diary contains detailed accounts of the spring dance incident we heard about, including the hit-and-run accident and several other escapades that would be quite damaging if made public today. "The hit-and-run," Diana said thoughtfully. "Was Mayor Hartwell involved in that as well?" Inspector Slack consulted his notes. According to the diary, Hartwell was driving, but he wasn't alone. There were 3 other students in the car, all of them drunk, and they hit a pedestrian near Miller's Pond. The victim was seriously injured but survived. and the matter was covered up. Completely. The sheriff at the time was Hartwell's uncle, and the victim was paid a substantial sum to keep quiet about the incident. Eleanor witnessed the accident and the subsequent cover-up, but she was too frightened to come forward at the time. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her expression had taken on the concentrated focus that indicated her mind was working through the implications of this revelation. So Mrs. Whitfield had been sitting on evidence of both a serious crime and a personal betrayal for over 20 years. Exactly. And according to the diary's final entries, she had decided that the time had come for justice. She writes about her plans to expose everything in her memoirs, starting with the reunion as a sort of public announcement of her intentions. Diana shook her head in amazement. 23 years of planning revenge. How extraordinary. The diary makes it clear that she never forgot or forgave what Hartwell did to her. She writes about watching him build his political career on the foundation of lies and covered-up crimes, while she struggled as a single mother in a society that condemned such things. Inspector Slack turned several pages in his notebook before continuing. There's a particularly revealing entry from just last month, where she writes about her final confrontation with Hartwell. She had demanded that he publicly confess to the hit and run and acknowledge Janet as his daughter, or she would expose everything. And his response? According to Eleanor, he laughed at her, said that no one would believe the accusations of a bitter old woman against the word of a respected mayor. That was apparently the final straw. Miss Marple set down her knitting entirely. So she arranged the meeting for last Saturday, ostensibly to give him one final chance to cooperate. That's our theory. The diary's last entry, written on Friday night, says she's meeting R the next afternoon to settle accounts once and for all. She seems to have been convinced that she held all the cards. But she underestimated his desperation, Diana observed. Inspector Slack nodded grimly. Hartwell had everything to lose: his political career, his family's reputation, his freedom if the hit-and-run case were reopened. Eleanor may have thought her knowledge protected her, but it actually made her a target. Miss Marple had risen and was pacing slowly around the room, her mind clearly working through the sequence of events. "Inspector, have you arrested Mayor Hartwell?" "Not yet. We're building the case carefully. The diary provides clear motive, but we need more concrete evidence of his presence in the soda fountain at the crucial time." "And the sabotage of the ice cream freezer? Does that fit with Hartwell as our suspect?" "It could. As mayor, he would have access to information about police procedures and timing. He might have known when the building would be unguarded." Miss Marple paused by the window, gazing out at the rain-soaked village street. "There's something that troubles me about this scenario, Inspector." "What sort of something?" "Well, if Mayor Hartwell killed Mrs. Whitfield to prevent the exposure of his past crimes, why would he risk returning to sabotage the freezer? The illegal prescription operation had nothing to do with his motive for murder." Inspector Slack frowned. Perhaps he was concerned that the prescription records might somehow implicate him. "Or perhaps," Miss Marple said quietly, "the person who sabotaged the freezer was not the same person who committed the murder." Diana looked up sharply. "You think there might be two different criminals?" "I think there might be multiple people who had reasons to want Mrs. Whitfield's various operations shut down. The murder might have been committed by someone seeking to silence her permanently, while the sabotage might have been carried out by someone who simply wanted to destroy evidence of their participation in the prescription scheme." Inspector Slack made several rapid notes. That would complicate matters considerably. "Murder cases are rarely simple, Inspector. People's motives are complex and their actions don't always follow logical patterns." Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting, but her hands moved with the deliberate precision of someone whose mind was occupied with weightier matters than needlework. "Tell me, Inspector, when you questioned Janet Whitfield about the diary, how did she respond to learning the truth about her parentage?" "She was devastated, naturally. Claimed she had no idea that Mayor Hartwell was her real father. Says her mother had always told her that her father was a wonderful man who died young, and she never questioned the story." "And her reaction to learning about the hit and run?" "Shock and horror. She keeps saying she can't believe her mother kept such terrible secrets for so many years. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. It must be quite overwhelming for the poor girl to lose her mother and discover such disturbing truths about her family simultaneously. She's asked to see the diary herself, but I've told her it's evidence in a murder case. She'll have to wait until after the trial. Assuming there is a trial, you still need to prove that Mayor Hartwell actually administered the strychnine. Inspector Slack's confidence seemed to waver slightly. We're working on that. The diary provides clear motive, and we know he had an appointment with Mrs. Whitfield at the time of her death. But motive and opportunity are not the same as proof of guilt. You'll need to demonstrate how he obtained the strychnine, how he administered it without being observed, and how he managed to leave the scene without arousing suspicion. We're investigating his movements that afternoon. Someone must have seen him. Miss Marple smiled gently. I'm sure you'll be very thorough, Inspector, though I confess I'm still troubled by several aspects of this case that don't quite fit the pattern you've outlined. Such as? Well, for instance, the precision with which the murder was carried out. Mrs. Whitfield was poisoned at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way, to create the maximum appearance of an accident. That suggests a level of planning and calculation that doesn't quite match the profile of a desperate man acting in the heat of the moment. Inspector Slack looked uncomfortable. Perhaps Hartwell is more calculating than we assumed. Perhaps, or perhaps we're still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. As the afternoon light faded beyond the rain-streaked windows, Miss Marple continued her knitting with the steady rhythm that indicated deep thought. The discovery of the diary had certainly provided important insights into Mrs. Whitfield's motives and plans, but it had also raised new questions about the complex web of relationships and secrets that had ultimately led to murder in the seemingly peaceful village of Little Wickham. Chapter 8. Blackmail at the Lunch Counter. Saturday morning arrived with the peculiar quietness that seems to settle over a village when momentous events are pending, and Miss Marple found herself reflecting that exactly 1 week had passed since Mrs. Whitfield's murder had transformed the peaceful community of Little Wickham into a hotbed of suspicion and revealed secrets. Inspector Slack had requested her presence at the police station, ostensibly to review the evidence they had assembled, but Miss Marple suspected he was hoping for insights that might resolve the nagging inconsistencies that continued to plague the case. We've uncovered the full extent of Mrs. Whitfield's blackmail operation, Inspector Slack announced, spreading a collection of documents across his desk with the methodical precision of a man determined to impose order on chaos. It's far more extensive than we initially realized. Miss Marple examined the papers with the careful attention she might have devoted to studying a particularly complex knitting pattern. How extensive! At least 7 regular victims, all paying monthly amounts ranging from $50 to $200. The total income from blackmail alone was nearly $1,000 per month. Diana, who had accompanied Miss Marple to the station, gasped at the figure. That's more than most people earn from legitimate employment. Considerably more. Mrs. Whitfield had built herself quite a profitable enterprise based on other people's secrets and mistakes. Miss Marple studied one of the documents more closely. These appear to be records of meetings, all held at the lunch counter of the soda fountain. Exactly. Mrs. Whitfield was conducting her blackmail business right under everyone's noses, disguising extortion as casual social visits. A victim would come in for coffee and pie, chat pleasantly about the weather, and slip an envelope of money under their plate before leaving. How very civilized, Miss Marple observed dryly, almost like a social ritual. Inspector Slack pointed to a leather-bound ledger that lay open beside the other documents. This was hidden behind the false panel with the love letters. It contains detailed records of every payment, cross-referenced with initials and brief notes about the nature of the compromising information. And Mayor Hartwell's payments, the largest and most consistent, $200 monthly for the past 18 months, with notations indicating that the amount had recently been increased from $150. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. An escalation in demands. That suggests Mrs. Whitfield had been preparing for something significant. The reunion and the memoirs, we assume. She was squeezing her victims for one final large collection before exposing them all publicly. Diana leaned forward to examine the ledger. But that seems almost vindictive. If she was planning to expose them anyway, why continue collecting money? Inspector Slack's expression grew grim. Because she wanted them to suffer financially as well as socially. According to the records, she had been systematically increasing demands on all her victims over the past 6 months. Miss Marple turned several pages of the ledger, her sharp eyes taking in the meticulous details of Mrs. Whitfield's operation. This notation here, next to Mayor Hartwell's entry, what does final demand signify? We believe it refers to her ultimatum about the public confession. She'd given him until the reunion to admit to the hit and run and acknowledge Janet as his daughter or face complete exposure. And the other victims? Did they receive similar ultimatums? Inspector Slack consulted his notes. James Morrison from the bank was being blackmailed over discrepancies in loan approvals that benefited his relatives. Sarah Mills was paying to keep quiet about an affair with a married city councilman. Each of them had received notice that their arrangements were being renegotiated. Miss Marple closed the ledger and folded her hands over it. So Mrs. Whitfield had effectively declared war on all her victims simultaneously. A rather dangerous strategy. Dangerous enough to get her killed, apparently. But by whom? You still haven't been able to place Mayor Hartwell in the soda fountain at the crucial time. Inspector Slack's confidence seemed to falter. We're still working on that. But the motive is overwhelming, and the opportunity was certainly there. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her mind clearly working through the implications of what they had learned. Inspector, have you considered that Mrs. Whitfield's escalation of demands might have been motivated by something other than simple greed or revenge? What do you mean? Well, suppose she had learned that one of her victims was planning to take action against her. She might have decided to force a confrontation by increasing the pressure on everyone, hoping to flush out the potential threat. Diana looked alarmed. You mean she might have known someone was planning to kill her? I think Mrs. Whitfield was a woman who understood the psychology of blackmail very well. She knew that cornered animals become dangerous, and she may have been trying to control the timing and circumstances of the inevitable confrontation. Inspector Slack made several notes. That would explain the appointment with R at exactly 3:30. She was forcing the issue. Precisely. But it also suggests that she believed she could control the situation, which proves she underestimated her opponent's desperation. Miss Marple stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the main street where ordinary people were going about their ordinary Saturday business, unaware of the dark currents that had been flowing beneath the surface of their community for decades. Inspector, have you been able to determine how Mayor Hartwell has been funding these blackmail payments? $200 monthly represents a significant expense for a small-town mayor. We're investigating his finances now. There are some irregularities in the town's accounts that suggest he may have been embezzling municipal funds to pay Mrs. Whitfield. Embezzlement as well as the original crimes. The man certainly had a great deal to lose. More than enough to justify murder in his mind. Miss Marple returned to her chair, but her expression remained troubled. There's still something about this case that doesn't quite satisfy me, Inspector. The evidence against Hartwell is quite strong. Oh, I don't dispute that he had motive and probably opportunity as well. But the execution of the murder still bothers me. It was carried out with a precision and calculation that suggests someone with intimate knowledge of Mrs. Whitfield's habits and routines. Hartwell had been meeting with her monthly for 18 months. He would have known her schedule. Perhaps. But consider the timing. Mrs. Whitfield was poisoned at exactly 3:30, during her daily cherry cola break. The killer had to know not only that she would drink the cola at that precise time, but also how to administer the strychnine without being detected. Inspector Slack shifted uncomfortably. The soda fountain was crowded that afternoon. Anyone could have slipped the poison into her drink. Anyone with access to the preparation area, yes, but that would require familiarity with the establishment's layout and procedures. What are you suggesting? Miss Marple's knitting needles had appeared in her hands, and she was working with the steady rhythm that indicated deep thought. I'm suggesting that we may have been so focused on motive that we've overlooked the practical aspects of the crime. Poisoning someone in a crowded public place requires not just desperation, but also opportunity and expertise. Expertise? Knowledge of poisons, access to the victim's food or drink, and the ability to carry out the crime without arousing suspicion. Those requirements point to someone with very specific qualifications. Diana looked between Miss Marple and Inspector Slack with growing understanding. You're thinking of someone who worked in the soda fountain. Or someone with intimate knowledge of its operations, yes. Inspector Slack's expression had grown thoughtful. We've been assuming that Mayor Hartwell administered the poison during his appointment with Mrs. Whitfield. But what if the poison was administered earlier by someone else? Someone who knew that Hartwell would be meeting with Mrs. Whitfield at 3:30, and who wanted him to be blamed for the murder. Miss Marple's needles clicked with particular emphasis. Exactly, Inspector. What if Mayor Hartwell is not our murderer, but rather our intended scapegoat? Chapter 9. The Truth in the Spilled Syrup. Sunday evening found Miss Marple seated in the parlour of the mayor's residence, a circumstance that would have seemed highly improbable a week earlier, but which the strange events surrounding Mrs. Whitfield's murder had made not only possible but necessary. Mayor Robert Hartwell sat across from her, his usually confident demeanour replaced by the haggard appearance of a man who had spent several sleepless nights contemplating the ruin of everything he had worked to build. I didn't kill her, he said, for perhaps the dozenth time since Inspector Slack had brought Miss Marple to conduct what the inspector termed an informal interview. I know how it looks, with the diary and the blackmail payments, but I swear to you I didn't murder Eleanor. Miss Marple studied him with the calm attention she might have devoted to examining a particularly interesting flower in her garden. But you did meet with her that afternoon. Yes, I met with her, at 3:30 just as she demanded, but she was already dying when I arrived. Inspector Slack, who had been taking notes with sceptical efficiency, looked up sharply. Already dying? You expect us to believe that you arrived to find Mrs. Whitfield conveniently expiring from strychnine poisoning? I know how it sounds, but it's the truth. When I got there, she was sitting at her usual spot behind the counter, but something was wrong. Her hands were shaking and her pupils were dilated. She kept saying, "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had been clicking with gentle rhythm, paused momentarily. Those were her exact words? Yes. She seemed confused, disoriented. I thought at first that she was playing some sort of game, trying to frighten me. But then the convulsions started. And what did you do? Hartwell's face flushed with shame. Nothing. God help me, I did nothing. I watched her die, and I was grateful for it. Diana, who had been listening from her chair by the window, gasped audibly. You just stood there? You don't understand what that woman had done to my life. 23 years of blackmail, of living in constant fear that she would destroy everything I had built. When I saw her dying, my first thought was relief. Inspector Slack's pen scratched furiously across his notebook. So you admit to being present at the time of death and to making no attempt to help the victim. I admit to being a coward, not a murderer. By the time I realized she was genuinely in distress, it was too late to help her. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her eyes remained fixed on the mayor's face. Tell me about the cherry cola. What about it? Was Mrs. Whitfield drinking it when you arrived? Hartwell frowned, clearly trying to recall details he had perhaps tried to forget. Yes, she had the glass in her hand. She took a sip just as I walked in, then made a face like it tasted wrong. Wrong how? Bitter, she said. Too much syrup or something, but she drank it anyway. Miss Marple's needles clicked with particular emphasis. And where was everyone else during this conversation? The soda fountain was busy, as usual for a Saturday afternoon. Tommy Fletcher was serving customers. Janet was in the kitchen. There were teenagers at most of the tables. And yet no one noticed Mrs. Whitfield's distress. People were focused on their own conversations. And Eleanor, Mrs. Whitfield, she was trying to hide what was happening. She kept motioning for me to sit down, trying to carry on a normal conversation even as the poison was taking effect. Inspector Slack looked up from his notes. You're claiming that someone else poisoned Mrs. Whitfield, and you just happened to arrive in time to witness her death? I'm not claiming anything. I'm telling you what happened. Miss Marple set down her knitting and folded her hands in her lap. Mr. Hartwell, during your previous meetings with Mrs. Whitfield, did you ever observe her preparation of the cherry cola? She always made it herself, very particular about the proportions, the amount of syrup, the ice. Said it had to be perfect. And on Saturday afternoon, who prepared the drink? Hartwell's brow furrowed in concentration. I'm not certain. When I arrived, she already had it. Think carefully. This could be very important. I remember seeing Tommy behind the counter earlier, but Eleanor always insisted on making her own afternoon cola. She didn't trust anyone else to get it right. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Slack. So if someone wanted to poison Mrs. Whitfield's cherry cola, they would need to know her exact routine and have access to the preparation area. Yes, I suppose so. And they would need to know that you had an appointment with her at 3:30. Anyone could have overheard our arrangements. Eleanor wasn't particularly discreet about her business meetings. Inspector Slack had stopped taking notes and was studying the mayor with a new expression. Mr. Hartwell, do you have any idea who might have wanted Mrs. Whitfield dead badly enough to frame you for her murder? Frame me? Hartwell looked genuinely surprised. You think someone deliberately tried to make me look guilty? It's a possibility we're considering, Miss Marple said gently. After all, your appointment with Mrs. Whitfield provided perfect cover for the real murderer. Everyone would assume you had killed her during your meeting. But who would do such a thing? Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, but her expression had taken on the focused intensity that those who knew her had learned to recognize as particularly significant. Someone who knew about your relationship with Mrs. Whitfield, someone who had access to these soda fountains operations, and someone who was desperate enough to commit murder. That could describe several people. Indeed it could. But it also described someone who made a crucial mistake. Inspector Slack leaned forward with interest. What sort of mistake? The spilled cherry syrup, Inspector. Remember how it was positioned so precisely near where Mrs. Whitfield fell? We assumed it was placed there to support the accident theory, but what if it served a different purpose entirely? I'm not following. Miss Marple's needles clicked with the rhythm of someone whose mind was working through a complex problem. What if the syrup was spilled accidentally by someone who was nervous about administering the poison? Someone who was not as familiar with the preparation routine as they pretended to be. Diana had been following this exchange with growing excitement. You mean the killer made an error that revealed their identity? I mean the killer revealed something about themselves through their actions, yes. The question is whether we've been observant enough to recognize the significance of what we've seen. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "Mr. Hartwell, you're not under arrest at this time, but I strongly advise you not to leave town." As they prepared to leave the mayor's residence, Miss Marple paused to consider the implications of what they'd learned. If Hartwell was telling the truth about arriving to find Mrs. Whitfield already dying, then the real murderer was still free, still moving among the innocent people of Little Wickham, still convinced that their crime had been perfectly executed. "Inspector," she said quietly as they walked through the gathering dusk, "I think it's time we had another conversation with the people who were in the soda fountain that afternoon. Someone saw more than they've admitted, and someone knows more than they've told us. You think one of them is our killer? I think one of them has been very clever about hiding their guilt behind the obvious suspicion that would fall on Mayor Hartwell. But cleverness and perfection are not the same thing, and even the most careful murderer makes mistakes." The evening shadows were lengthening across the village square as they made their way back to Diana's cottage. But Miss Marple's mind was occupied with cherry cola and spilled syrup, with nervous hands and bitter tastes, and with the growing certainty that the solution to Whitfield's murder lay not in the obvious motives of blackmail and revenge, but in the subtle details that revealed the true character of the person who had administered the fatal dose of strychnine. Chapter 10. Justice Served Cold. Monday morning brought with it the crystalline clarity that sometimes follows a storm, and Miss Marple found herself reflecting that the events of the past week had indeed been very much like a tempest, sweeping away the comfortable illusions that had masked the darker currents flowing beneath Little Wickham's placid surface. She had requested that Inspector Slack gather all the principal figures in the case at the soda fountain itself, a suggestion that had initially met with resistance but which she had insisted was essential for the proper resolution of the matter. The establishment looked strangely forlorn in the morning light, its cheerful chrome fixtures dulled by a week of neglect, and its red leather stools arranged in silent reproach to the tragedy that had unfolded there. Janet Whitfield had reluctantly agreed to open the premises for what Inspector Slack had diplomatically termed a final review of the evidence, though Miss Marple suspected the young woman understood that something more significant was about to occur. Tommy Fletcher sat hunched at the far end of the counter, his usual sullen expression replaced by something approaching genuine fear. Mr. Pemberton occupied a corner booth, his hands trembling with their characteristic nervous energy. Mrs. Sarah Mills had positioned herself near the door, as if prepared for a hasty retreat, while Mayor Hartwell stood with the rigid posture of a man who had resigned himself to whatever fate awaited him. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, settling herself on one of the counter stools with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention through quiet competence rather than dramatic gestures. "I know this has been a difficult week for everyone, and I appreciate your patience as we work to understand exactly what happened to Mrs. Whitfield." Inspector Slack had positioned himself near the cash register, notebook in hand, while Diana took up a strategic position where she could observe all the assembled suspects. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension and barely suppressed anxiety. "We've learned a great deal about Mrs. Whitfield's various business enterprises," Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational despite the gravity of the subject. "The blackmail operation, the illegal prescription scheme, the plans for public exposure through her memoirs. All of these activities created multiple motives for murder." Tommy Fletcher shifted uncomfortably on his stool. "We know all that already. When are you going to arrest somebody?" Miss Marple smiled gently at the young man's impatience. "Murder cases are rather like knitting, Tommy. You have to be very careful about following the pattern, or the whole thing unravels in quite the wrong way." She stood and moved to the spot behind the counter where Mrs. Whitfield had fallen, her movements deliberate and thoughtful. The killer wanted us to believe that Eleanor Whitfield died in an accident, a simple slip on spilled ice cream. When that deception failed, they were content to let suspicion fall on Mayor Hartwell, whose appointment with the victim provided perfect cover for murder. But Hartwell had every reason to kill her, Mrs. Mills protested. The blackmail, the threat to expose his past crimes. Oh, quite so, Miss Marple agreed. Mayor Hartwell certainly had motive for murder, but motive alone doesn't make one a murderer. The question is whether he had the opportunity and means to commit this particular crime. She moved to the preparation area behind the counter, her hands tracing the path that Mrs. Whitfield would have taken during her daily routine. You see, poisoning someone in a crowded public place requires very specific conditions. The killer needed to know exactly when Mrs. Whitfield would drink her cherry cola, how she prepared it, and where she would be when the poison took effect. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. Any of the regular customers could have observed her routine over time. True, but this wasn't a crime of long-term planning. The strychnine was administered on Saturday afternoon, shortly before Mrs. Whitfield's scheduled meeting with Mayor Hartwell. That suggests someone who made the decision to commit murder quite recently, probably within the preceding few days. Miss Marple paused beside the cherry syrup dispenser, her expression thoughtful. The killer made several crucial errors, but the most revealing was the spilled syrup. It was positioned too precisely, too conveniently, to be the result of Mrs. Whitfield's fall. But more importantly, it was spilled by someone who was nervous, someone whose hands were shaking as they prepared the poisoned cola. She turned to face Janet Whitfield, who had been standing silently near the kitchen door throughout the proceedings. Someone who knew the routine intimately, but was not accustomed to actually carrying it out themselves. Janet's face went white. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, my dear. I'm stating quite directly that you poisoned your mother's cherry cola and then attempted to make her death appear accidental. The silence that followed this accusation was broken only by Tommy Fletcher's sharp intake of breath and the distant sound of traffic from the main street. Janet stood frozen, her face a mask of shock and dawning despair. You killed her because you had finally learned the truth about your parentage, Miss Marple continued gently. Not from the diary, which you had never seen, but from your mother herself. She told you that Mayor Hartwell was your real father, didn't she? She said... Janet's voice was barely audible. She told you about the affair, about the pregnancy, about how he abandoned her when she needed him most. And then she told you about her plans for revenge, her intention to destroy him publicly at the reunion and through her memoirs. Janet's composure cracked entirely. She was going to ruin him. My father. My real father. She was going to destroy his life out of spite. So you decided to protect him by silencing her permanently. I didn't mean for it to happen like that, Janet's words tumbled out in a desperate rush. I just wanted to make her sick, to prevent her from going through with her plans. But I must have used too much strychnine. Inspector Slack had moved closer, his handcuffs ready, but Miss Marple gestured for him to wait. You obtained the strychnine from Mr. Pemberton's illegal stock, didn't you? You knew about the prescription operation, knew where the medications were hidden. I helped with the distribution sometimes, I knew where everything was kept. And you knew about your mother's appointment with Mayor Hartwell, knew that he would be blamed if anything happened to her during their meeting. Janet's voice broke completely. I never wanted anyone else to be hurt, I couldn't let her destroy him. He didn't deserve that, not after all these years. Miss Marple's expression was infinitely compassionate as she watched the young woman's confession pour out. And the sabotage of the ice cream freezer? That was your attempt to destroy evidence of the prescription operation? I thought if the police found the medications, they might realize I had access to the strychnine. I had to try to cover my tracks. Inspector Slack stepped forward with quiet authority. Janet Whitfield, you're under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Whitfield. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Janet looked up at Miss Marple with eyes full of anguish. I loved her, you know. Despite everything, I loved my mother. But I couldn't let her destroy an innocent man for the sake of her revenge. I know, dear, Miss Marple said softly, but murder is never the answer, no matter how noble the intentions. The soda fountain fell silent as Inspector Slack led Janet away, leaving the remaining witnesses to contemplate the tragic irony of a daughter who had killed her mother to protect the father who had abandoned them both decades earlier. Later, as Miss Marple and Diana walked through the village in the gathering dusk, Diana voiced the question that had been troubling her throughout the final confrontation. "How did you know it was Janet?" The evidence against Mayor Hartwell seemed so compelling. Miss Marple smiled sadly. "It was the spilled syrup that gave her away, dear. A nervous amateur's mistake, not the work of a desperate politician. Janet knew her mother's routine intimately, but she'd never actually prepared the cherry cola herself. When the crucial moment came, her inexperience and her emotional state betrayed her. And Mayor Hartwell's account of arriving to find Mrs. Whitfield already dying? Quite truthful, I believe. Janet had administered the poison shortly before his arrival, probably hoping that Mrs. Whitfield would simply become too ill to continue with her plans. When the dose proved fatal, Janet was fortunate that her mother's appointment provided such a convenient suspect. They paused outside the darkened soda fountain, its cheerful facade now a monument to the destructive power of long-buried secrets and misguided justice. "What will happen to the building?" Diana asked. "Inspector Slack mentioned that the town council is considering converting it into a community centre. Perhaps something good can come from this tragedy after all." As they continued their walk through the peaceful streets of Little Wickham, Miss Marple reflected that justice, like her knitting, required patience, careful attention to detail, and the wisdom to see patterns that others might miss. The truth had been revealed, but at a cost that would leave scars on this small community for years to come.